Art doesn't occur in a vacuum. In fact, one might argue that art can act as a thermometer, measuring culture, politics, and the general moment. So let's set the scene. It's 2025. As a nation, we've withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement. Our state, Illinois, is experiencing extended droughts and large-scale dust storms. We're also approaching the 200-year anniversary of when settlers came into McLean County and used teams of oxen prairie breakers to rip up native prairie, making way for industrialized agriculture. At around the same time, the Indian Removal Act made Indigenous peoples subject to state-sanctioned genocide and desettlement. But there's progress today. The state of Illinois recently returned tribal territory back to the Prairie Band of Potawatomi Indians in DeKalb County. Bison are back at Midwin Prairie. There's also a renewed sense of urgency around preserving the climate and the importance of pollinator species. This is part of the motivation for domestic rewilding, a living land acknowledgement. This is an animal-powered native plant earthwork. And if you're not familiar with that term, earthwork or land art describes art that is made by shaping the land itself. This project reflects wider concerns around interspecies and reciprocal relationships, eco-social engagement, climate change, and community building, using the capacity of art to address pressing social and climate issues in unconventional ways. I met Shannon in 2022 at a workshop that he was giving about land acknowledgements. And I was familiar with these things. I knew that they were written or verbal acknowledgements that said whose land we're on, and they often also noted specific tribes or native nations. But what was new to me was the idea of a living land acknowledgement. So after the workshop, I immediately approached him and asked if he wanted to have a conversation about creating a living land acknowledgement on the grounds of Illinois State University.
So one of my issues with land acknowledgements is that that's all they are. They're just an acknowledgement of the genocide and the dispossession that's already taken place. And this is Illinois State University's land acknowledgement. Beyond that, they don't really do anything unless they're accompanied by action, by reparations, reconciliation, restoration, actions that institutions are often reluctant to undertake. So Ruth approached me about collaborating and explained her practice, land art using animal labor. And I asked what that meant, and then I learned about her oxen, Clark and Sparky. And at first, I really wasn't sure what to make of this. It struck me funny, the idea of making art with cows. But obviously, I learned more about what Ruth does and why. So we started talking, what could a living land acknowledgement be? And I was thinking about the medicine wheel and medicine plants and indigenous agricultural practices, none of which I know much about, actually. But the idea that this space should be circular and it should involve indigenous native plants was important. But I'm Ojibwe, my people didn't live here, and I can't really speak for the native people who did, for the Peoria, Miamia, and Kickapoo, and many others. But with my theater background, I kept circling back to ancient Greek theaters and the idea that the Greek theater, the amphitheater, developed from the idea of a threshing floor. It was a circular, paved, flat area where grain was threshed using animal labor.
So I said to Shannon, why can't performance be part of this too?
And that's where Sunset on the Longest Day began, with the question of what does land acknowledgement even mean for Native people?
So this earthwork is located at the publicly accessible Illinois State University Horticulture Center, which is right across the street from the auditorium that we're in today. And starting in about a month, we're going to begin work on what is going to turn into a curated prairie with walking paths surrounded by a semicircular mound. It's about 330 feet long, and it's going to be planted with native prairie plants throughout. And we're positioning this work as a living land acknowledgement, so a tangible recognition of the genocide and displacement of Indigenous peoples. We're putting action behind these typically performative statements made by institutions regarding whose land we're on, Because without resources, time, concerted effort towards actually improving Native people's lives, supporting the land back movement, or developing reciprocal relationships with those nations that we list in these acknowledgements, those words fall flat. However, the ISU Horticulture Center has made a 10-year commitment to this work, and this has been a grassroots effort led by faculty, staff, and community members.
So sunset on the longest day first happened in 2023 on the summer solstice on the site of domestic rewilding.
The longest day of the year, get it? But it marked the beginning, the groundbreaking for the earthwork.
And it's a relational performance event. So my background is in theater, in directing and devising, but the term relational art, comes from visual art, and it was coined by Nicolas Bourriaud, a contemporary French art critic. And to paraphrase his definition, it's really the meaning of the work lies in the viewer's experience of it. So sunset on the longest day wasn't scripted. It was 8 Native people telling their stories in the moment. But it felt ceremonial, but it's not a ceremony. The event borrows as much from 12-step meetings and music videos as it does from anything traditional. But it felt a certain way. It felt like a ritual, and you had to feel it to understand it. So it began 1 hour before sunset, and 8 Native people stood in a circle around a fire, each holding a set of signs, of placards at their chest, and each sign had a single word on it, and when you read them together, they made phrases. The first, such as, "This is a time to remember." So a drum kept time, and every 30 seconds there was a drum beat. The people in the circle would tear off the top sheet of paper and crumple it up and throw it in the fire and reveal a new set of phrases. So the first phrase is, "You took our land, you took our languages." 30 seconds, drum beat. "You took our children, you took our religion." 30 seconds, drum beat. And this continues for 8 sign changes. Then a person in the circle began speaking in answer to a question that they already knew but had not been publicly asked. And it was, "Who are your people?" And their answer was accompanied by a flute player. So they're answering questions that no one is asking of Native people. When the first speaker was done, there's 8 more sign changes, and we come to the next person in the circle, and they spoke in answer to the question, "What happened to your people?" And so on around the circle. So in order to read the signs that they're holding, the viewers had to walk around it, right? And kind of, because they're facing inwards towards the fire, so you had to read the signs between the bodies of the performers. And then when someone was speaking, everyone found that they needed to stop and kind of lean in and listen. So there was this alternating of movement and stillness, movement while the crowd moved around the circle, and then stillness when the performers spoke. Because it was outdoors, they weren't mic'd, you had to stop and lean in and listen. And for the viewers, you couldn't always hear everything or see everything, but it made you very conscious of the act of listening and engaging in this communal act of listening. So the final set of signs read, "Now watch the sunset on the longest day."
Symbolically making the first pass at building the earthwork, I walked with Clark and Sparky, who you see pictured here, and they were wearing a set of bells from a Conestoga wagon. So we went around the perimeter of the circle, symbolically marking that first go at the earthwork.
So the sun was going down on the long day of settler colonialism, and Native people had been heard, and now we could be in community together. So everyone roasted marshmallows over the fire. Choreographer and artist Adelie Judy has a saying, "Art sanctifies." And that's what this performance was. It was the consecrating event for domestic rewilding. And just as the land art is a physical mark on the land, performance creates a psychic and a spiritual mark. It happens, and then what comes after that is different or changed by the action of the performance.
Sounds really heavy, Shannon.
It was. But it was also cathartic and transformative, and in that way, it was joyous and affirming. I believe some things need to be felt in order to be understood, and live performance engages our empathy as human beings.
And the earthwork isn't just considering humans or human empathy. The piece is fabricated, maintained, and activated by collaborative interspecies labor. So that includes teams of horses and oxen working the soil, human hands planting species like big bluestem and cardinal flower into the earth, and then the critical labor of pollinator species who actually maintain the site once it's planted. So by employing this multi-layered approach, the work invites the community to be in relation to and through the performance, to the land, and to one another. And the earthwork aims to have a positive impact on the non-human world. So oxen and draft animal power in general, that's a renewable power source. And using animals, working with animals to cultivate land means that we don't have to use these fossil fuel consuming, heavy soil compacting equipment. The animals also provide composted manure that enriches depleted soils at the sites. And by planting these native prairie plant species, they have these huge, long, deep root systems. And so the earthwork itself is going to eventually sequester carbon on its own, providing cleaner air, healthier soil, and making habitat and food sources for all of these other critical species. But most importantly and most effectively through Shannon's performances, the project as a whole aims to create a sense of belonging, all people, all species.
So the first performance in 2023 was To Break the Ground. At that point, I thought it was important that Native people be heard. Now in 2025, the impetus for the performance is to restore and replant. So we're in a different time and place now, figuratively, metaphorically speaking. Today, our sense of community feels endangered by politics, by economics, by epidemics, but it also feels empowering when we experience community. For this performance, the underlying ideas are creating and strengthening community, of being in communion, of being together and doing something, sharing something. So literally, we need to plant, so spreading seeds will be part of the action of the piece. But we're also renewed by one another. So the work aims to bring people together to plant seeds. And I feel the absence of connections and our politics, our economics, the zeitgeist, works to ensure that a lot of us feel irrelevant, feel like we don't matter. So this time, Sunset on the Longest Day is about our relationship to one another, that we're part of a community and that we all matter to that community. It asks that we relate to each other, to tell one another something, and to remind each other that we all matter. In my tribal language, you all, or I'm from Michigan, so we say yous guys. In Anishinaabe-Moin, that is Indino-Maganadog, which means all my relatives. And that's really what the piece is about, that we are all related.
So here's your call to action. Show up, support Indigenous people, listen to them, hire them, honor their agency, make room in your organizations and your businesses for their voices to be heard, and then follow through on your promises.
And anywhere you stand in the Americas, you're standing on stolen native land. So remember that. And if that makes you feel uncomfortable, or if you feel like you don't know much about the native history of where you are, that's intentional. You weren't taught that on purpose, because that history is ugly and it's hard to deal with. But native people, we were erased. They tried to erase us, but we're still here. So remember that. You're standing on native land, and honor that by learning more about the people on whose land you're standing. And make it right. Learn the history, support native people, support native causes, give land back. Literally, you can do that. If you own land and you donate it to a native tribe, they will happily accept it. As for the performance and the earthwork, I can describe it, but to understand it, you really need to feel it. You need to experience it for yourself. Because it gets at something deep. It's not just about being native or being a settler, but it's about being a human being.
So we would like to invite all of you to come out and be with us on Friday, June 20th, 2025, at about 7:00 p.m., right across the street at the ISU Horticulture Center.
Miigwech and
Thank you.
Bamapi. Thank you.